Groovy. Our first storyteller is Bill Zarchi. Bill has led a big, long, interesting life. He's a retired writer, photographer, director of photography. He's published a memoir. He's published a novel. He's a graduate of the EPIC storytelling program at the Stage Bridge in Oakland. This is a very fun story I got a chance to hear. It's called A Chance Encounter. Sometimes you don't know how important events are going to be later in your life. So please welcome Bill Zarchi.
About a year after I graduated from college, many years ago, I attended a wedding in Marblehead, Massachusetts, right on the water at a very swanky country club. The bride's name was Stephanie. The groom was my good friend Butcher. I was a groomsman, and the maid of honor was a lovely young woman named Beverly. Now, I'd had the hots for Beverly for quite some time. Long blonde hair, beautiful face, sparkling blue eyes. But we had decided after our one blind date together during college that it would be better for us just to be friends. Actually, Beverly had decided it would be better if we were just friends. But nevertheless, we were happy to see each other at the wedding, and after the ceremony, at the reception, she came up to me and she said, "Hey, how'd you like to walk down to the beach with me and smoke a joint?" Well, I did, and we did. And we had a lovely time walking along the sand as the sun set behind Massachusetts Bay. And Beverly said, "You know, I'm working at a candy factory in Boston this summer. We're making sugar daddies." "Really?" "Yeah," she said, "I'm staying in an apartment with 3 other girls. Why don't you come visit sometime? You can sleep on, you can come visit and crash on our couch." And I've got to warn you, there's a lot of couch surfing in this story, so if that offends you, you better wait out front. So this offer sounded great to me. I'd endured 4 years at Dartmouth when it was still a men's school, what we used to call monosexual education. And then I had been teaching in Vermont for a year, which was very much like living in a monastery. The idea of 4 girls in one apartment was really appealing. So I went home to my parents' house in Long Island, and I thought, maybe I'll go see Beverly next weekend. But I'd just driven back and forth to Boston for the wedding, and I wasn't sure I wanted to do it again just a few days later. So I thought, well, I'll wait 2 weeks. No, maybe I'll wait 3 weeks. But I was weighing this, but I had kind of a dead-end job that summer. I was working for my congressman in his local district office, which sounded really cool. But I was one of several unpaid interns. They really didn't have much for us to do. And in 6 weeks I'd been there, I'd seen the congressman exactly one time for about 5 minutes. So I quit my job, and I drove to Boston. And Beverly greeted me at the door when I knocked. And she said, "Hey, there's somebody here you know." And it was a guy named John, who had been a classmate of mine in college. I didn't know John very well. I knew we had a bunch of common friends. I knew he'd been a theater technician and stage manager in the drama department when we were undergraduates. But we'd never really had a conversation. One thing I did know about John was that until about the time we graduated, not that long ago, he'd been dating Stephanie, who was the bride from the week before. And the first thing John said, "Hey, how was the wedding?" And I cringed. And then he laughed and he said, "It's fine. Stephanie and I were over a long time ago." So John and I started to talk. And we talked, and the whole time we stayed there for a very long weekend, about 3 or 4 days. And we talked, and we really bonded, and we really became good friends in that short amount of time. Now, in the years since we had left college, John had enlisted in the Army. This was the height of the Vietnam War in 1969. And his draft board had said, "When you graduate, we're going to draft you. But if you want to enlist, they promised they would guarantee his choice of military occupation. That was a big lie. John was trained as a clerk, which was not his dream. And when I saw him at Beverly's, he was about to ship out to Vietnam. Now, I was terrified of being in the Army. I was terrified of going to Vietnam. And I had taken a job teaching high school in a small town in Vermont, hoping for an occupational deferment, which was pretty much in the cards at that point. After a time at Beverly's apartment, John went back to see his mom in New Jersey before shipping out. I went back to my parents in Long Island, but we made an arrangement to meet in New York City for a farewell dinner. And we did. We met in Midtown Manhattan. Feels like this mic is slipping on me. We met in Midtown Manhattan. We had a lovely dinner. We went to the movies. We saw The Chairman with Gregory Peck. And we wandered around Midtown. And we actually saw Broadway Joe Namath, who was then the star quarterback of the New York Jets, walking along in an elegant suit with a beautiful babe on each arm. And we wandered over to Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts, which was virtually brand new at that time. And in the middle of Lincoln Center, between the Philharmonic Hall and the Opera and the Ballet, these beautiful new buildings, there was a lovely plaza. And in the middle of the plaza was a fountain. And John and I sat down in the fountain, and we chatted for pretty much our farewell chat. Now, I knew John would not survive Vietnam. I knew in my heart of hearts that he would be killed over there. And nevertheless, to put a good face on it, I said, "So what do you think you're going to do when you come back from Nam?" He said, "Well, I don't know, I'm kind of thinking I'd like to go to film school." I said, "Film school? What's that?" This was a new idea, and film school wasn't a big deal back then. He said, "Well, I guess you get to study about movies, and you get to make movies." Now that sounded really cool to me. When we were in college, there was a film society where you paid $5 a quarter. You got a little punch card which gave you admission to 20 or 25 movies in the course of every quarter. At every film, they distributed a 4-page, single-spaced review of the film written by a student, which talked about the movie, it talked about the director's work, about other directors, about different movies that some of the stars had been in. And it was really stimulating. And in town, in the little town of Hanover, New Hampshire, where we were in college, there was a theater downtown. Downtown was 3 blocks long. The Nugget Theater, and the Nugget ran all double features. They specialized in foreign films and classics, and they changed the program twice a week. So there was a lot of stimulation about movies and films at Dartmouth, even though there were almost no film classes. And I spent a lot of nights staying up late, talking to friends of mine about movies. Well, John went back to Jersey to ship out, and I went back to Long Island, and I went back to my teaching job in Vermont. And we promised to write back and forth. And I wrote to John, and he wrote to me, and we kept up a pretty steady correspondence for about half a year. And then I heard nothing from him, and I really feared the worst had happened. Meanwhile, things were changing in my situation. I flunked my draft physical twice. I was grossly overweight, and I had high blood pressure documented back several years. Flunked my physical. And in addition to that, the selective service system that administered the military draft had set up a lottery system based on your birth date. And in the lottery system, if you were number 1, you were absolutely going to get drafted. If you were number 365, it was highly unlikely. Any number over 200, 220, 240, you probably wouldn't be drafted. My number for my birthday, February 21st, was 363. So I no longer needed an occupational deferment. And I applied to film schools. I applied to half a dozen schools around the country. NYU, BU, UCLA, USC, Stanford, and San Francisco State. And I was admitted to none of them. I had absolutely no background in performing arts. I'd done a lot of writing and a little bit of photography. And my dad was a writer-photographer, but they didn't care about that. and I was admitted to none of the places I applied, except for one. I got into Stanford, of all places. Stanford had a small film program, which was then in the communication department, and they took me. And I finished my teaching obligation and made plans to go. The next summer, I drove out to California with my then girlfriend, and we stayed in Butcher and Stephanie's apartment in Berkeley on LeConte Avenue, less than a mile from here. And we stayed there for a few days. Butcher and Stephanie were back east visiting family, and they were happy to let us stay there. And one morning early, the phone rang, and she got up and she answered the phone, and I heard her say, no, they're not here. No, they're out of town. Yeah, we're just friends. We're staying. We're taking care of the apartment. Who? Yeah, just one moment. And she came in and she shook me and she said, it's for you. It was John, back from Vietnam, just mustered out of the Army, calling from Oakland, and very much alive. Well, we picked him up and we brought him back to the apartment. He crashed on the couch. And we celebrated for several days, as you can well imagine. And I asked him what had happened to our correspondence. And it turned out that the Army had scooped up John to help work on a theatrical production of the off-Broadway musical, The Fantastics. True story, which they were putting on in war zones all around Vietnam. So GIs could walk off the battlefield and into this wistful musical love story. Try to remember the time of September when life was slow and oh so mellow. Remember that? Yeah. The Fantastics, in Vietnam, in war zones. And because he was on the road so much, his mail never caught up to him, and he apparently stopped writing to everybody. I found out later that John's mother was so upset that he didn't write to her, that she called her congressman, who contacted the Army, and the Army brass contacted John's commanding officer, who brought him in and said, "You must write to your mother." I don't know if he ever did. Well, John flew back to Jersey to see his mom, and my girlfriend and I drove back to the East Coast, where we parted company. A couple of weeks later, I drove back out to the West Coast. The 3 times I crisscrossed the United States on the roads that summer, the kind of thing you can only do when you're 23 and have no responsibilities in life. This time I drove with John, his former girlfriend Stephanie, and her new husband Butcher. It could have been really awkward, but we all got along well and we had a great time. We drove into Canada and we drove along the north shore of Lake Superior, which was some of the most beautiful country I'd ever seen. And eventually we ended up back at the apartment in Berkeley. John was invited to crash on the couch there with Butcher and Stephanie, and I drove down to Stanford, where I rented an apartment with my friend George and began the film program. A couple of weeks later, John came for dinner, and it got late, and we said, why don't you crash on the couch and stay over? So
This is in Stanford.
this is at Stanford, yes. Where else would it be? And John stayed over for a couple of days, and then a week, and then a couple of weeks, and at the end of a month, he offered to pay rent. Now, this was a 2-bedroom apartment, and John was sleeping on the couch and did not have his own bedroom, but he was happy to pay 1/3 of the rent. I mean, rents were nothing back then. He was happy to share the rent, and a few months later, we rented a 3-bedroom house. We acquired another roommate named Paul, and John continued to sleep on the couch and continued to pay his full share of the rent. So now in this house in East Palo Alto, we had John, Paul, George, and I was Ringo. Couldn't play the drums. Now, John proved to be a very useful kind of guy. He immediately got a job at the Palo Alto Community Theater based on a lot of his theatrical experience. And because of that, he had a good good way of, he understood production. He came out with me as crew on some of my student films and also worked with some of the other people in my program. And partway through that, my first year at Stanford, John applied to and was admitted to the same film program, and he started a year after I did. He was in the class after me. Eventually, he hooked up with Anne, who he had dated in college before Stephanie, and after a while, they moved in together. Now, I saw Beverly 2 more times. The first time, she called me from Petaluma, where she was living on a chicken ranch for some reason. And she invited me to come visit and, you know, crash on the couch. So I went to Petaluma, drove to Petaluma, and about 1 minute after I got there, she said, "Hey, how'd you like to drop acid and go see the new Riders of the Purple Sage in a live show?" I said, "Great." And I did, and we did. And so pretty soon we were driving across the back roads of Northern California, blitzed out of our mind on LSD, in Beverly's new ride, which was a decommissioned mail truck. And we got to the venue, which was the Inn of the Beginning in Katati. Yes, I hear that. And we walked in and we went all the way to the front of the venue and we sat down right in front of the stage. And we looked around and we realized the place was empty because it was 2 o'clock in the afternoon and the gig didn't start till 8. So we waited and we waited and we waited, and eventually the roadies came and they set up amps and drums and guitars. And then eventually the band showed up and they did a sound check. And eventually they played their gig. Now the pedal steel guitar player for the new Riders of the Purple Sage that day was none other than Jerry Garcia on A Night Off from the Grateful Dead. And we spent a marvelous evening with Jerry beaming huge smiles at Beverly and me, probably more at Beverly than at me. And we had a wonderful time. Now the last time I saw Beverly, I brought along my friend Susan, who I'd met in an editing room at 3 a.m. at Stanford in the film program. Susan was a lovely woman who I really had the hots for, with curly black hair and beautiful smile and warm brown eyes and a great brain. Beverly really liked Susan and took me aside and asked what was going on there. And I said, our relationship is completely platonic. Because Susan and I had decided to be friends. Well, Susan had decided we should probably be friends. Are you sensing a pattern here? Yes. Well, Beverly winked at me and she said she thought that there was some kind of a future there. And she was right. On my 25th birthday, about a year into my friendship with Susan, she put on a surprise birthday party for me, which was a lovely thing to do. Late in the evening, I had to go back to the film department and edit something that was due the next day. And Susan suggested that I come back when I was finished, no matter how late it was. Well, we became lovers that night. And the next night, we went to my place, which was a little cottage that I was then renting right off campus on College Terrace. And she never went home. And that was, because my birthday was last Saturday, that was 54 years, 3 days, 4 apartments, 2 houses, 4 dogs, and 2 kids ago. I'm not done. Now, John and Ann became some of our closest friends. After film school, John had a long career as a film editor working on major motion pictures and independent films. Ann went to law school and worked for the EPA for years. Susan worked as a film editor for many years and then had a second career as an elementary school teacher. And I spent a long time seeing the world shooting for Silicon Valley companies and medical technology companies. and at home shooting a variety of different kinds of projects, including a lot of shows for the Grateful Dead, where I was, once again, this far from Jerry Garcia. Pretty cool. In a lot of ways, we had we followed parallel paths. John and Ann bought a Toyota wagon one year, and the next year, Susan and I bought a Toyota station wagon because John had done all the research and decided it was the best car. And who were we to disagree? I mean, really. They had 2 kids about 4 years apart, and we had 2 kids about 4 years apart, but they started well before us. When they got married, before children, when they got married in the Redwoods south of San Francisco, I took photos and Susan played the recorder. When we got married at a temple south of San Francisco, about 7 years later, almost long enough for a common law marriage, when Susan and I got married, Ann took photos, and John was a groomsman. John and Ann bought a house in Albany, about a half a block north of Solano Avenue. Susan and I went to visit, went for dinner, really enjoyed the small town vibe. And we bought a house in Albany, also about half a block north of Solano Avenue, and 5 blocks away from John and Ann. Well, the kids are grown and gone now. We still live 5 blocks away from them. And in fact, Susan and John and Ann are all here tonight. How about that? John and Ann are now among our oldest friends, except for a few people back east from our early lives. They're our oldest friends. And we still enjoy their company. Sometimes when we haven't seen them for a long time, we realize we just bought the same coffee maker, or we just bought the same barbecue grill. I never saw Beverly again, but I heard through mutual friends that she moved to South America. And a few years ago, I found her on Facebook living in Peru. She still hasn't answered my friend request, but that's okay. But sometimes I think about how my life turned on a chance encounter. And for years I thought, well, the chance encounter was running into Beverly at the wedding, but that wasn't quite right, because we were both in the wedding party, and that was our seeing each other that night. That night was preordained. Really, the chance encounter that mattered, the gossamer thread on which my whole life turned, was my decision to go see Beverly 1 week after the wedding. If I'd gone 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later, as I was contemplating, John wouldn't have been there. And I could easily have ended up in another profession with a different wife and a different family in a different city. No Susan, no Stanford, no film school. Now, Susan and I were visiting relatives back east recently, and we were in New York City, and we had lunch in a restaurant across the street from Lincoln Center. And afterward, we walked over there, and we went to the same fountain where I'd had that talk with John. And I was really struck by the moment, so many years before, and I burbled to everybody about this and was excited and talked about how my life had changed and everything that had happened since then depended on what had happened in Lincoln Center that night. It was really a delicious moment, and I wanted to share it with John. And I called him up, and it rang and rang and rang. And eventually, I got his answering machine, and I left this whole story on the answering machine, just kind of burbling my head off. I knew he would love to hear about it, and I knew he wouldn't mind getting it in a voicemail, because after all, that's what good friends are for. Thank you.